Everybody who's in the hall can settle. We'll begin and people can keep on joining in. Can you all test your mics, please? Chal rahe hain?
Yes.
Okay, they're all
Yes, bro.
okay. And if everybody can please put their phones on silent or switch them off because people keep forgetting to put them on silent. Great. I think we're already 5 minutes over, so I'll begin. My name is Hassan Tahir Latif. I am a literary editor with the Alif Review. I am co-publisher at the People Press, and we are launching our first collection of sonnets, our first book of poems, tomorrow at 4:15 in Hall 4. So just a little bit of plug-in. Please be there. I'm really excited to host this panel because the more I learn about my esteemed guests, the more excited I got to speak to them. The panel is documenting journeys, but it's a lot more than that because our panelists are not just talking about journeys, but they're also talking about political climates, they're talking about deep time, they're talking about climate change, they're talking about identity and being a third culture kid and just a lot of fun stuff. So I will introduce them and then we'll take it from there. So first of all is Sunela Jayawardene. She's recognized as Sri Lanka's leading environmental architect and conservationist. She has designed several award-winning projects such as the Rainforest Ecolodge. Her work reflects a deep concern for sustainability and place, something that we'll be talking about today. She founded the Federation of Environmental Organizations and has advised the Sri Lankan government. Alongside her design, she is also the author of The Line of Lanka, and which was nominated for the 2017 Gratian Prize. If I am mispronouncing that, I hope not. Okay. And Ravana's Lanka, which explores the relationship between myth, landscape, and identity. Next, we have Kaya Genç. I hope I'm remembering to pronounce it correctly. Genç.
Yes.
Who is a European Press Prize finalist, whose tech reporting for Rest of the World has received a grant from Ford Foundation, and he's the author of 4 books, The Lion and the Nightingale, Under the Shadow, An Istanbul Anthology, and Masera. Kaya has contributed to the world's leading journals and newspapers, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, and the Times Literary Supplement. He's contributing editor at Index, so there's more. He's contributing editor at Index on Censorship since 2013 and at, what did I write? And at the Dial since 2024. Kaya is the Istanbul correspondent for the Los Angeles Review of Books. Welcome to Lahore. Aube Rey Lescure is a French-Chinese-American writer whose debut novel, River East, River West, has been shortlisted for the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction, and it was the only debut novel on the 2024 shortlist. She's also been shortlisted for the Maya Angelou Book Award, the Carol Shields Prize, and the Stanford's Fiction with a Sense of Place Award. Rey Lescure grew up in northern China, Shanghai, and southern France with her French expatriate mother. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Granta, Guernica, LitHub, Electric Literature, and more. And she's currently editor-in-chief at Off Assignment. Welcome to all of you to Lahore, to the Indus Conclave. Thank you for being here. I hope it's been a fun journey so far, pun intended. I'd like to begin with all of you just talking a bit about your work, and Aube, if we can start from you, just to contextualize this conversation so that our audience also gets to know a bit more about all the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for such gracious introductions. I like to say that all of my writing is born from place and an obsession with place and setting. So I am a novelist. My book-length work, the one that was published last year, River East, River West, and the novel I am working on now, are both fiction, which is challenging for me because I identify primarily as a nonfiction writer and an essayist, actually. And my primary subject when it comes to essays has to do with movement, travel, walking, borders, migration, etc. So I think a lot about who gets to travel and what makes for worthy travel writing, which ties into my other role as editor-in-chief of Off Assignment, a nonfiction literary magazine that primarily publishes essays focused on journeys and place. And in my role as editor, I read a lot of submissions that primarily have to do with travel and journeys. And that just gives me so much fodder to think about who's writing about what kind of journeying and what do we select to publish and what is my role as a gatekeeper or a platform giver.
Great, thank you. We will get into that in a bit. Kaya, if you can just talk a bit about the work that you do, especially all your writing on Istanbul.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for being here. I studied English literature and I did a PhD on Victorian literature, and I was a kind of scholar working on these dead writers from the 1890s when lots of protests began in Istanbul in the 2010s, and this led me to write more about my immediate surroundings. And I also received a commission to publish a book about travel writing about Istanbul in 2013. So I started reading all the travel writing about Istanbul produced by American writers, French writers, British writers, beginning from 15th century. So I amassed this palimpsest of representations of the city from Western eyes. And when I write my fictions on Istanbul, I tried to challenge those representations. So my sense of place emerged from reading rather than an observation of my surroundings. And when I started writing about the place, I tried to challenge those representations because in many cases, the representations of Istanbul by Western writers has been in terms of, a kind of loss of this paradise, this Byzantine city that falls to the barbarians, and then some ambassadors and some foreign travelers come and represent Istanbul as this kind of lost capital. And rather than telling the stories of its people, they tell the stories of its ancient ruins and buildings. I'm sure we can talk about the architectural aspects of that. Yes. The St. Sophia and the ruinous buildings, the city walls, and the people just disappear for several centuries. Mark Twain comes and writes about the stray dogs of Istanbul. Others write about streets, about different interesting aspects. But the people are kind of overlooked and ignored until the 20th century. So this kind of interest about how to represent this place has fueled my work.
Thank you. And that is what we'll come back to as well, because there's such a sense of humanism in your work, and you put people first. When I started reading The Lion and the Nightingale, the way it just starts with this one person's journey before the protests happen, it's such a great hook. And when we get into questions on craft, that is something that I'd like to discuss as well. Yes, Sunela.
So, for me, I was born in Sri Lanka. And when I was 18, I went to New York to study architecture. And I think it was that dislocation which made me really confront a sense of place, a sense of belonging. And I think that's something that sort of percolated in me over the years. It was reflected in my architectural work, in my exploring vernacular building systems and styling, and with that came sort of obviously contextual design. And in that process, I also started picking up stories that had been submerged in presented histories. And like I said, there are always histories which are presented to us. But when you travel in the countryside, a lot of my work as an architect would take me into areas because I designed a lot of resorts and villas and stuff like that. And I started picking up on stories which I didn't really hear when I was being educated, formally educated. And it was that really got me writing. Writing is something I said, it was almost sort of a release, easy thing to do. My first book I wrote while I was deeply immersed in my architectural practice. And then now I've retired to what I refer to as the heartland of Sri Lanka, which is a very remote part right in the middle. And there I pick up more stories, which had been sort of tagged as myths by Western colonizers. And then when you talk to people deep in the country and you hear that they actually don't see them as myths, but very much a part of our historical narrative, then you begin to think again, and then so many things fall into place. And that's what I have written about in both my books, about the historicity of myths.
And could you actually just elaborate a bit about this research? Because I think that'll be something quite fascinating for our audience, the myths that you're talking about when it comes to Sri Lankan history.
It's not been actually a very structured or methodical research, because as I said, I wrote the first book while I was deeply immersed in my architectural practice. It was stories that I was picking up. I would be looking at a site, laying out a project, and then I'd start hearing things, and these are sort of little things that were getting lodged somewhere in my brain. And it was like mosaic, setting out, and clear. The patterns were emerging. When I wrote my second book, Ravana's Lanka, which is actually the historicity of the whole Ramayana legend, which is very much a part of South Asia, then it was more, I think, methodical in that I already had a skeleton of a story, and then it was looking for me to fill it up. And so that's really been, so it would be by talking to people, looking at archaeological work, which is very minimal because we have a official historical narrative, and then there's this other older story which doesn't always sit comfortably with the official.
And I think that's something that we can also relate to, because of course we come from a land that is very ancient. We have two very ancient civilizations. We have the Indus Valley civilization, something that we're trying to pay homage to with the title of this conclave, and then there's also Mehergarh, which was even older and a contemporary of the Mesopotamian civilizations. But by and large, the state narrative ends up being when Muhammad bin Qasim came to South Asia, and that's what Pakistan's identity is. But a lot of us, we relate to where we came from, the Aryans or the people who came from Arabia, but a lot of us have roots directly here along the Indus, and that's just something that I hope people will continue doing more work like you, and people will take inspiration and write about our actual ancestry when it comes to this land and our relationship to it. A question that I wanted to ask, I feel all three of you have already answered, a sense of displacement that led you to write. But I would like to ask how the historical memory of the places, whether recent or ancient, influences the way you approach your stories and the sense of belonging or displacement within them, whether nonfiction or whether fiction. So perhaps, Aube, you can start with that. How does the historical memory of the places that you've come from, and you have a lot of identities when it comes to culture, so how does that work with your writing?
I think I suffer from a syndrome of circularity in my travels, as in if I feel strongly about a place, whether positively or negatively, I will find myself traveling to it again and again and again, seeking to understand something about the pull the place has on me. And I found myself doing this with Spain a lot. I, in my 20s, would travel to Spain every year. I walked the Camino de Santiago, which is a long-distance pilgrimage trail that cuts across the Iberian Peninsula, which has a very long history dating back since medieval times, perhaps earlier, as a trail of pilgrimage. And once I started doing it, I became obsessed with it, and I kept on returning year after year to walk different routes. And I think I was
Do you have your little book with all the passports that the stamps that they
yes,
give
yes,
you
I
at
had the
different-
pilgrim's
yes.
passport, and every day you basically walk between 20 and 30 kilometers into the next village or city, and then they have pilgrim hostels where you can stay for very cheap. And I think the first time I did it, it transformed my relationship to space and to what the human body could traverse, the human body's relationship to pain. But I also think I had never felt so purposeful in my life, which is strange to say because on the pilgrimage, there is no other purpose besides getting through the amount of kilometers you have to walk that day in order to seek shelter. And I think a reason why that circularity of wanting to go back and redo the thing, revisit the place, has less to do with nostalgia than with chasing a feeling that a past self might have felt and trying to understand who that person was, but also what that feeling was. And that for me is a reason why I suffer from this syndrome of circularity. And I often actively, I'm so glad I'm in Pakistan today because it's my first time visiting here, and I often have to actively force myself to plan journeys to new places instead of trying to uncover some mystery of the past. But I mentioned this in my panel this morning. I feel a great kinship for writers like Roberto Bolaño or Patrick Modiano or W.G. Sebald, who seem to also be very circular in their work and keep on going back to, in Bolaño's case, Mexico City of the 70s, trying to unpack some mystery that seems never ending, no matter how many times you revisit.
Thank you. Walking does play such an important role when it comes to documenting a landscape, because I feel Robert McFarlane's book, The Old Ways, has been instrumental for me to understand how much of a role walking a landscape can play when it comes to your writing and the way you interact with the land. So I'll direct this question to you, Kaya. How much walking did you have to do to understand Istanbul, and in a way that wasn't the way it was presented in your readings?
Yeah, so I was living very close to Gezi Park, where the protests happened in 2013. And I was living in this apartment on the street that was kind of dividing the more westernized part of the city where the activists lived. And just around the corner, there was the more conservative side of the neighborhood began. And there was a barricade just opposite my window. So I was looking at it, and it was a very contested street. We're talking about contested identities, contested spaces. So I wrote a book called Under the Shadow, Rage and Revolution in Turkey, which is about, can I walk to both sides of the barricades? Can I talk to people in the conservative neighborhood, what they made of the protests? Because it was kind of Occupy Wall Street type of protests in 2013. How did they see it? Because some people rushed to the park to save it, and the government supporters rushed to the airport to defend the prime minister at the time. So both sides were very passionate about it, and I didn't want to do like both sidism, but I wanted to be able to talk to both sides about what drove their passion. And it was all about space. Like, we want to defend the green spaces of the city. They just have different ideas about how to defend them. So this park, which was occupied by thousands of young people, and the government wanted to build a shopping mall there and transport the trees to a different part of the city. So this is the kind of the government rhetoric is more about we can transport nature to make room for our construction projects on which our economy is based, and the activists saying no, you cannot just play with nature like that. But it was very informative for me to just talk about these people who were very passionate about place and space. So I had to do lots of walking in the city. But then this turned into an Istanbul book, which has its own limitations. Like, can you understand the Netherlands just by going to Amsterdam, or can you understand Germany by just living in Berlin? I don't think it's possible, and it's similar in Istanbul. And actually, just a few neighborhoods of Istanbul, these contested neighborhoods of Istanbul. And the more I read about representations of Istanbul, and the more I talked to people on both sides of the barricades, I understood that the interests of people just concentrated in these centers, in these geographic centers, and the rest, it's almost like these dark places where no one wants to understand and talk. So I wrote another book called The Lion and the Nightingale, which was about traveling in Turkey to understand the broader landscape. But of course, you can't do it by yourself. I cannot just walk in the country. So I had to get the perspectives of different people from different sectors of life, and to walk in their shoes, to just accompany them as they walk, which then comes with its own problems about representation. How do you represent, let's say, a divorced Kurdish woman? How do you represent an imprisoned journalist? Can you really put yourself in their shoes? So these are all questions that we can further discuss.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that sense of uprooting nature and constructing something else instead, something more concrete based, is something we can all relate to in our own city, Lahore, as well, because there's lots of construction that's taking place that doesn't take into account where, for example, the river historically flowed, and now you have sites that are going to be built as the new cities, and that's what's wreaking a lot of havoc on our environment. But you spoke about a sense of creating a sense of immersion, and I would just like you to carry on from that. So what are your approaches to creating a sense of immersion and authenticity in your writing? Because that is something that's very important when it comes to narrative nonfiction, because there is the narrative there, but how do you create characters that are compelling? Because you cannot hide behind fiction. And Aube, if you later on also want to jump in on that, the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction, because when it's real people, it's their stories, and what sort of challenges arise, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, my idol as a young writer was Flaubert, and I wanted to write like him, like an invisible writer, and just let the characters speak, the details speak. And I wrote my first book around those principles. Like, I didn't exist in the book, but then I got too. And I wrote my first book around those principles. Like, I didn't exist in the book, but then I got too much criticism, and it was the era of autofiction. Like, everyone writes about themselves, their own experiences. And so in my second book, The Lion and the Nightingale, put myself also as a character who's traveling the world, going to Lahore, going to Amsterdam, Italy, different places, while all these experiences are happening in Turkey. So there are like two layers going in their different trajectories. And this sense of feeling very guilty. I had this guilt of being free and being able to move and talking in festivals while people were experiencing these hardships in the country. And then this sense of passion about the fates of these people then became the juice in the prose that drives everything. It really gave me a sense of purpose, because the idea of the invisible author is a kind of old construct. And of course, even, I mean, both sidism is of course a problem, but even the sense of writing objectively is very problematic. So I had to put myself as a character, and then and my last book is an autofiction, all based on my experience, very interior, of living in Amsterdam, a different project. But I think I moved from this objective Flaubertian ideal to more autofictional writing.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I was recently holding a workshop on narrative nonfiction writing, and I'm glad that there are lots of students here as well. One thing that I feel when people, and Aube, if you want to also then comment on it from the writings that you commission, that a lot of narrative nonfiction writing, people try to do this objective style of writing where you're no longer the character or you remove yourself. But I really like this one thing that Alexander Chi, the writer, said about an essay or narrative nonfiction being a quest, and it's your personal quest, and it takes you from the personal to the universal, and it's about your personal interactions with the world around you, the sensorial interactions that you have, the historic interactions that you have, and the relationships you create with other people. So since you commission these essays, Aube, if you could just talk a bit about what goes into making narrative nonfiction and documenting journeys, or what makes a good piece stand out for you?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think a lot about, and for me, it comes down a lot to making the writer's position clear. A question of positionality entering the text. Who is a traveler? Who is the author? Who is a narrator? What is their relationship to the place? What is their relationship to the subject? Why are they telling this story? And I think as long as a reader of a piece, I have a sense that relationship is clear and honestly presented, then I have enough grounding to move through the narrative. And it's all right if the writer is only a transient visitor to a place. And, I'm in Pakistan for only 2 days. If I were to write an essay or a piece about Pakistan, I would want to make that very clear from the onset and not claim any kind of, in-depth expertise and long-term immersion in the country. And I think in a lot of essays I read, there's the opposite urge of this all-encompassing representation or capturing. In the English language, the word to capture is used a lot when we think about journeys and travel experiences, the sense that something needs to be locked and contained. And there's almost a sense of like conquest to the word capture. And I think that's a trap that a lot of writers fall into, that myself as a younger writer, I fell into, that I wanted to capture an experience, I wanted to represent it, I wanted it to encompass everything. And in doing so, kind of flatten the narrative, because it is simply impossible unless you're writing a very long book that's very, very well researched and interviews many subjects. So I think that's my rule of thumb as an editor is I'm most drawn to personal narratives where the writer's positionality to the story is very clear. And the magazine is called Off Assignment precisely because it started as a place where journalists could publish stories that happen behind their reporting. Because oftentimes writers or journalists on assignment go to these fascinating destinations and have all these fascinating conversations with people, and what makes it to the printed page or to the final product is only a tiny fraction. It needs to be rather objective.
Yes. Thank you. And I'm glad you talked about, when you're writing a longer book, it's something different, because you have written 2 books exploring the same, history of a country. One, as you said, while you were working as an environmental activist, an architect, and then a conservationist. But now you wrote the second book while living in the heartland of Sri Lanka. How did that work for you? The sort of historic research that went into it, and I'm also really curious to understand how the book was received, considering you were writing about a past that wasn't really, the official story, as you said.
Well, I think so. The first book was it was a collection of essays of multiple myths and legends, with a focus on the Ravana, who was the villain in the Ramayana, as the villain as presented by um, the standard sort of more popular Indian versions of the Ramayana. And then my second book was actually just concentrating on this whole Ravana, the historicity, and was there actually a civilization in which he was the most iconic king. And for me, it was there was so much more to tell, and I think that's what the second book came out of. The first one, yes, there was this whole segment on Ravana and his the possible kingdom that he ruled. But the other stories were really much smaller. For instance, like I wrote about the Sufi community in Sri Lanka, which nobody really
Interesting. Tell us more
knew.
about that.
Yeah, which nobody really knew existed, and it was again, walking to some of these Sufi shrines and interacting with the Sufis, who are very much, it's almost like a hidden sect that survives there. It's very old.
And
Sufi
where
practice.
did they come from?
They're all over the island. From South India, probably. They themselves don't know, but we also have Iraqi saints who had come and lived in Sri Lanka, like Jailani, Daftar Jailani, and places. So those are smaller stories. And then when I went with the bigger book, there's still so much more to tell. Yes, so I think
And that's, I suppose, also the job of an author or a writer, right? Because you can't always write everything that there is, and you just put these kernels out there in the world for somebody else to follow and dig deeper and go into that story. So, for example, if anybody wants to go to Sri Lanka and look up at, Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka, that's a great story. Somebody should commission me for it. But since we're talking about landscapes and journeys, when you're writing something like this, as I said, an essay, or when you're exploring a city, even fiction for that matter, it's such a personal quest. And your internal landscape also changes. So I'm really eager to know a bit more, starting from you, and then everybody should just weigh in. How has doing this research or your writing careers, how have they changed your internal landscapes, and where are you now as opposed to when you first started observing and writing?
well, I think I'm still feeling like my eyes are still opening, and like Aube said, it's I can't even begin to say I'm capturing this. I am still sort of waking up to this tremendous depth and breadth of information that is there. And so what I'm seeing is, yes, I do know this, for instance, the peaks that I see in front of where I live today, I know their names now, and I know some of the stories. But there are so many peaks that I don't know, and I know they're involved with the whole legend that I've been writing about. So yes, it's changed my visual perception and my general view of the sense of getting into water, which has so much depth, and I'm just getting my feet wet here.
And it's always sad to know that you can never really dive all the way down.
But I think it's wonderful because for me, the way I've written is I keep asking questions and saying, I hope the next generation will pick this up and take this ball and run with it.
Let's hope
Yeah.
so. And Kaya, if you'd like to talk about how your relationship with Istanbul and Turkey as a whole has changed, because I'm also interested in what you mentioned about division in the city, and that's something that we really know about Istanbul, but usually that western side of Istanbul is what's depicted as the fancier side, and as soon as James Bond needs to go chase someone, that's the bazaar, and it's dusty. But since you've traversed these streets yourself. How has your relationship with the city changed, and how has that internal relationship changed as well?
Yeah, you find some allies in the city, stories of from the past century, even. For example, James Baldwin came and lived in Istanbul, and he remade himself in Istanbul, in the very same neighborhoods where I live. And that is always an inspiration. Like you can, maybe in the U.S. you will not be treated fairly, but in Turkey you can remake yourself. At the same time, there are some geopolitical problems that keep you from discovering further, which I find interesting. For example, now I'm writing something about my grandmother, who was born in a Sufi lodge in Aleppo. And because of the civil war, I could never visit Aleppo, although it's very close. And now that I'm writing, I want to see that Sufi lodge and where she was born. And she died in Istanbul, and kind of structure it around that. But sometimes the politics doesn't allow you to discover your roots. I mean, I'm rooted in Istanbul, but my grandmother is coming from the former Ottoman borders, from inside the Ottoman borders. And sometimes things like COVID stop you from traveling, and then geography becomes a problem. I was writing about this Armenian painter from Istanbul who lived in the 19th century called Kirkor Köçayan, just investigating his stuff. And I learned that his paintings are in San Lazzaro in Venice, in this island that was funded, that was kind of, that hosts Armenian properties. And because of COVID, I couldn't go. So like you want to write something about a local character in Istanbul, but which forces you to travel, because it's a city where people come and stay for a while, and then move on to other places. So it's this interesting relationship with the geography. It makes you want, it forces you to travel, just like the characters who live there. And sometimes the politics or things like COVID don't allow you, and you're frustrated.
How does that? Istanbul is the city that's always known as this place where a lot of people have gone to remake themselves, as you said, James Baldwin, and some really iconic photographs of him are from his time in Istanbul. How has that city changed you? I mean, has it? Have you remade yourself over the last 10 years, writing about the place?
Yes, I mean, I lived on different parts of the city. I lived on Nişantaşı, Orhan Pamuk's neighborhood, and then I lived on Üsküdar, which is like the more pious and traditional neighborhood. And I came to also suspect the city because we're expecting a big earthquake in the city. And so you look at the city in different ways, like which parts of it is safer from the earthquake. But then the safer places are more boring, and the more interesting, the seedy parts of the city are more open to the earthquake. So I reevaluate the city different time according to the period. And it's a very liquid city. Like it just you cannot just have a very concrete idea about it.
Which is why I guess you can never really contain or capture landscapes or journeys, and you can't really, as you said, capture or put something in a box when it is so vast. But there are borders, as has been mentioned, and you are particularly interested in the borders. And little birdie told me that you want to also travel to the borders of China, northern China, right? Migration. So can you just talk a bit about that? What happens when borders are there and you can no longer, and these borders have just been placed, as we know, by the powers that be, by politics, by social political change. So if you can just comment on that.
Yeah, I have felt a draw that feels quite inexplicable to me to travel to Western China, actually, and Northwestern China, and just experience the borderland there in Xinjiang in Tibet, in Yunnan. China shares a border with Pakistan, of course. And I think if you are in China, there is this growing awareness of the Chinese West, like the great Western lands that are often actually romanticized in China. I think if you're in the West, China is often more discussed in terms of the Eastern Seaboard and the South China Sea, and many immigrants from China usually come from those more seafaring provinces. And I've started noticing this phenomenon when I started going back to China, even before the pandemic. All the malls, the super malls that are everywhere in Shanghai, instead of having H&M, Zara, Sephora, those kind of traditional clothing conglomerates, those stores were closing down and being replaced by outdoors equipment and fitness stores. And this trend continued. The fitness and outdoors industry is just booming in China to the extent that on an urban street, the coffee shops will have little camping folding chairs with tents and like fake little bonfires to recreate the sense of, the outdoors and camping. And this also correlated with car culture becoming much bigger in China. When I was growing up in China, most private citizens did not own cars. You never learned how to drive. There were taxi drivers, there were public transit. Now my father, a Chinese man at 60, learned how to drive and purchased his first electric vehicle for a very cheap price, as they're manufactured quite cheaply in China. And there's this cultural phenomenon of Chinese people starting to hike, Chinese people going west, Chinese people going on road trips to the great Western provinces. And I was like, this sounds really familiar. Oh, it's the Western Manifest Destiny kind of cowboy great Western road trip fantasies that I myself as a child romanticized about the US. I grew up outside of America, and I very much had this romantic notion of the great American West and the open road and the freedom of the road trip. And it's so fascinating to see that coming to China. I think both in terms of like a cultural trend, but also a response to the pressures of modernization and urbanity and this newfound kind of movement was having access to vehicles. So I think my personal interest in going to the Western Chinese borderlands finally have less to do with myself and my internal landscape, because I am so bored of writing about myself after an autofiction novel and countless personal essays. I think I want to go there to see what is this universal obsession with the open road and the romance of the great open spaces that we are seeing, both in the US, which is a well-documented phenomenon, but in China, which I feel like is talked about a lot within the country, but maybe is lesser known.
I can't wait to read what you're going to write. But it's so fascinating that you talked about the Western provinces, and I think obviously maps and the way a country is presented in the West plays such a huge role, because I would never have known had you not told me about these Western provinces being this place that people want to explore, because most of the maps that we see of China, it's just a lot of cities on the Eastern Seaboard, and then it's just emptiness. And I've always wondered, okay, so we share that border with them. Where do you go? How do you get to Beijing if you, for example, want to just drive from Pakistan to a lot of the work that you all have done in excavating the stories of your own countries or the places that you come from and writing about it. And if you'd also like to actually take it from here about access to this documentation, because a lot of times in Pakistan, we don't have access to this documentation because of the borders that have been placed. And a lot of work is in India, for example. And because of the political situation, we're not allowed to write about our own histories because we don't have documentation. Or if stuff's at the British Library, not everybody has access to it. So how was it for you? How were you able to excavate all of this, especially if, this was not the official state history of the country? So what went into your research?
So that's very interesting that you asked that, because when you talk of borders, there are so many borders. There are obviously political borders, which we all have, they've been imposed on all our lives. But there are also, there is access denied in terms of, there are some of these trails that I have explored, they are difficult to climb to. There are caves which have not been explored, so I can't access them for, very physical reasons. We had a ethnic war, and even after the war finished, which was about, that was in 2009, so it's almost 15 years, 16 years. But there are language barriers, and I can't, there is this distrust. Why is this woman from the south asking me questions? When I first started encountering the Sufi communities, I didn't know how receptive they would be to a woman asking questions. So I would tell my husband, can you go and ask them whether, But, so there are multiple boundaries, and I think multiple approaches to surmounting those borders. And I think that's half the challenge. I don't know how many years of trekking I have left in me, but I might die trying. But because there are stories in these remote villages that I can only walk to, and it's wonderful.
And do you find that most of the stories that you are writing about come from the people, or
from the people, from its the oral histories? So it's in their songs and in their poetry, and sometimes even in portions of some of our Ayurvedic medicines are stored in rhymes. And in those rhymes you'll see bits of references to histories, which obviously, so they've accepted this as these are true. So the multiple sources, and yeah.
Thank you. And Kaya, if you'd like to comment on that, and also the fact that when you are writing about a city that's going through political upheaval and a country that's going through political upheaval, how do you navigate that? Especially, like, what sort of censorship do you face? How truthful can you be? Because I believe good non-fiction writing, whether it's travel, whether it's just whatever you're writing about, essentially has to be authentic. And you use a lot of people as characters in your writing with a very humanist touch. How has it been to report those stories without facing any sort of backlash, or have you faced backlash for that? Because I think that's something that a lot of writers here would benefit from.
Yeah, it's difficult to know that in the foreign media, for example, you write for the New York Times. I wrote about the night of the coup, for example. Just the day after, they commissioned me to write about, so what happened? Just tell us your story. And then you give your own particular story of that day. And I was just in the middle of the street where the tanks were coming, and the police and the army were, shooting at each other. And then how do you represent this reality? You represent your own reality. And I ended my essay by saying, we slept without knowing who would win during the coup night, and in the morning we went to have brunch by the Bosphorus. The government won the fight, and then you just give your own personal perspective in such a way that is truthful to your own character. Like, you don't want to be ashamed of what you wrote. You don't want to be blind to what was happening just a few centimeters away from you. But at the same time, it's your own truth. And I kind of like feasting with the panthers. Like, it's something Oscar Wilde said that I like. It's the half the joy comes from the danger. And you put yourself out there, you're being watched, but still, like, you say, even under these circumstances, I'm going to try to be truthful. Of course, you never know whether maybe history will be the judge, but covering these conflicts from inside Turkey also comes with this responsibility, with those dangers. But at the same time, I feel like, I covered Turkey during the coup, and I survived. So if I have like a difficult situation, I'm like, I survived that, and I think I can survive this as well.
And just very quickly, do you believe that writing in English helps? Because as we were discussing earlier, Aube, your book, whether English or any other language, will not be available in China because there's that level of censorship. And in a lot of cases in Pakistan, we see that a book written in English can fly under the radar. However, as soon as it's translated into Urdu, and I feel like many people here who are nodding along know which book I'm talking about, they get picked up, and then the powers that be know what's being written about them. Do you think that helped? Writing in English, what is the relationship with people in Turkey with the English language?
Yeah, so both conservatives and the kind of the secularists, as they say, which I don't actually agree with, both obsessed with representation in English. So they both look up to Western publications, English publications. So I don't think I'm under the radar because of that. I'm just kind of trying to remake an image of the country as a local writer. And my first book was in Turkish, and now I'm publishing 17 years later another book in Turkish. So I write my fiction in Turkish, and then that's when they treat you as a kind of one of those with the book. Like if you're a writer without the book, you're a writer, but if you're a writer with the book, you have a different
I
treatment.
feel like I see people nodding along to that. In the interest of time, I'm going to first ask if there are any questions, and in the meantime, if you can all just sum up your thoughts on, are there any emerging themes or shifts in the cultural landscapes that you've talked about, in the geographical landscapes that you've talked about, that you find particularly compelling or challenging to address in your work? And if you can just mull over on that, and let's see if there are any questions. Yes, Nala, we have one question. Or do we have a microphone? And there's another question. I see Risham with her hand. So, idhar pehle? Idhar, please. And if we run out of time, then you don't have to answer that question. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been really amazing to hear from all of you. I've been conducting a workshop with participants here on reading 2 streets in the city of Lahore, but literally in 2 days, and like plugging in so many writing prompts and ways to experience the city, knowing that there is an otherness to the way we're doing it, and realizing that as well, but like catapulting into the space. And for those of us who studied abroad and read English literature as kind of like this main device in how we create craft and writing, and sitting in a decolonial world where we're also trying to like take ownership of like our own identities, I want to ask about perhaps some of the pitfalls in your career where you felt a kind of like colonial betrayal towards your own identity, let's say. And also, what are some of the crafts or methods that we as writers aspiring to decolonize our landscapes, the Orientalist writing, the male gaze, and all of these different things to be better writers towards our where we come from? Is it language? Is it I'd just love to hear tips, crafts.
Wonderful question. Who would like to field that?
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
So I write in the language of colonizers. I studied in Sinhalese, which is the language of my people. But I am more conversant in English. I can write better in English simply because I've read more in English. The literature that's available is much broader, wider, But at, in the back of my mind is definitely the fact that I'm still reaching for a colonial benchmark. And I don't know when that begins to change. I don't see it changing for a few more generations. So if someone tells me that, oh, get over it, you got independence 75 years ago. I don't know who decides that it's time to get over it. So I feel, I don't do justice to my heritage, but hey, this is the best I can do. And I can write about who and where I come from. And I hope that it reaches. But then again, is this other question of I'm challenging a official narrative. And when it comes in, say, Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, is this going to be like, get me in trouble? I don't know.
Not. And just to quickly add to that, I think decolonization is not a linear thing, right? And it first also begins with decolonizing the self and the mind, because we really think that, oh, if we're writing in the language of the colonizer, there's some sort of betrayal. But it's what you write and how you approach it. And I think that's more instrumental in being truthful to the narratives that you want to write about, as opposed to just choosing a different language that you don't really have a comfort level writing in. So I think it really comes from the self and then outward to the world. And if anybody else would like to comment on that, and then we'll move on to Risham's question.
I just wanted to comment on how much colonialism, Orientalism, exoticization is so alive and well in the English language travel writing sphere. It's like we are having all these conversations, and yet the major travel writing awards in the UK and in the US, when I see the titles or the pieces selected, it feels like they were written in the 1960s or 50s or before. It's very much this kind of nostalgic, orientalizing tone. And I think this is when actually having more representation of people who are not wealthy white men and women traveling to non-Western countries in the English language can kind of expand out what the models are out there, because in 2025, I think there's still, I think because the people who are alive, who are fans of that era of kind of, I was in Luxor, Egypt earlier this year, and it's shocking how in the field of archaeology and Egyptology, how you have essentially people dressed in costumes of like safari outfits playing the Agatha Christie era of the Egyptologists. These people are still alive and well, and that nostalgia is still alive and well. And their work is being overrepresented in the travel writing sector. So we actually need more voices of people who are not them writing in English to show that all kinds of people with all different kinds of skin color are traveling all kinds of places.
And I think it's very important that, yes. And I think it's very important that people like us get together and create our own narratives and perhaps our own awards, because as you were also discussing in your own panel, why do we need the Michelin star to come in and rate a restaurant? Why can't we just have something that's, to do with the global south, quote unquote? If we can just have Risham's question and then we'll wrap up. Is there a microphone? Yes, please, either Nietzsche. I just feel like there's so much more to discuss. It's just scratching the surface.
I know.
Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, thank you so much for such an illuminating conversation. My name is Risham Amjad, and I'm a writer, but like a poet, so very different. But I think while I was listening to each of you speak, and I guess my question is more personal, as a Pakistani woman, you have a really interesting relationship with public space and journeying, and there's a concept of being chaperoned or accompanied. So you often don't experience your own city or your own neighborhood on your own. You don't walk it, you don't live it, you don't breathe it. And for a lot of Pakistani women, often that experience comes when they're not in Pakistan, they're abroad. And that's how I've explored cities when I'm there. And I found that it really altered my practice and it made me write differently because I'm often trying to experiment with different forms or different practices, so on and so forth. And that became really essential to me. Like I was going out for walks and doing my writing then. So for all of you, Aube, you described this compulsion to take journeys and to revisit places. So was it that compulsion that made you, that informed your writing? Or this is addressed to all of you, was this compulsion to take journeys always there and then you started writing about it? Or did you, take these journeys and then you discovered you had something to say and you wanted to write?
Very
Thank you.
generic question, huh? Yes, who would like to begin?
Yeah, I think when you make the journeys, things happen to you, and things happen to you not only through your interactions with other people, but through your interaction with the place and geography, and then I think, especially in green places of Istanbul, for example, it really inspires you to write. Taking a long walk or by the Bosphorus, for example, during the war in Ukraine, the Bosphorus became a kind of war zone. Like you could see the Russian ships there, which were later blocked from passing the Bosphorus. And I would just look at the Bosphorus and get like a geopolitical picture of today. But at the same time, it's a very peaceful place where you see the other continent and you know that they are not so far apart, that you can just walk there. So it gives you a kind of metaphor for your writing. It gives you a sense of what's happening in the world. And it's just beautiful. We have this Orhan Pamuk quote. It says, "There is no problem in the world that a walk by the Bosphorus cannot solve." I really believe that. But you have to walk. You cannot just look at it on Instagram, or reduce it to an image or a reel or something. You just have to do the walking. And when I was becoming a writer, the idea of a flaneur and a flaneuse were very prominent. I don't know if they are as prominent today.
I think they are, and I think that's a wonderful note to wrap this up on. Although, as I said, there's so much more to discuss. But thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your insights, for sharing your work with us. And yeah, we need to do the walk. We have to walk. We have to do the work. And if you don't do the work, then the craft doesn't come out. And so, on that note, thank you so much, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. And enjoy the rest of your stay in Lahore.
Know that they are not so far apart, that you can just walk there. So it gives you a kind of metaphor for your writing. It gives you a sense of what's happening in the world. And it's just beautiful. We have this Orhan Pamuk quote. It says, "There is no problem in the world that a walk by the Bosphorus cannot solve." I really believe that. But you have to walk. You cannot just look at it on Instagram, or reduce it to an image or a reel or something. You just have to do the walking. And when I was becoming a writer, the idea of a flaneur and a flaneuse were very prominent. I don't know if they are as prominent today.
I think they are, and I think that's a wonderful note to wrap this up on. Although, as I said, there's so much more to discuss. But thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your insights, for sharing your work with us. And yeah, we need to do the walk. We have to walk. We have to do the work. And if you don't do the work, then the craft doesn't come out. And so, on that note, thank you so much, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. And enjoy the rest of your stay in Lahore.